Section 85 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mukund Manikarnike from Tempe, Arizona. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 9, Chapter 2, Conclusion Retrospect, Part 1. No modern European nation has endured such vicissitudes of good and evil fortune as the Spanish. From the virtual anarchy of the Castilian kingdoms under Juan II and Enrique IV, the resolute wills of Ferdinand and Isabella evoked order, and by the union with Aragon, the conquest of Granada, Naples, and Navarre, and the acquisition of the New World, they left Spain in a most commanding position. When under Charles V, to this were added the Netherlands, the Austrian possessions, Milan, and the headship of the Holy Roman Empire, the hegemony of Europe was secured, and the prospect of attaining the universal monarchy seemed sufficiently possible to arouse the fears of Europe. The loss of the Empire and of Austria, awarded to the younger branch of the Habsburgs, strengthened rather than weakened the inheritance of Philip II by rendering it less cumbrous and unwieldy, while the acquisition of Portugal unified the peninsula, and the increasing wealth of the Indies promised almost unlimited resources for the extension of his power. Yet this power, so colossal in outward seeming, was already becoming a mere shell, covering emptiness and poverty, for its rulers had exhausted the nation in enterprises beyond its strength and foreign to its interests. Throughout the 17th century, its downward progress was rapid until, at the death of Carlos II in 1700, it had reached a depth of misery and helplessness in which it might almost despair of recuperation. Yet its efforts in the War of Succession showed that it still possessed a virile nationality. Its decadence was arrested, and a slow upward progress was begun, accelerated under the enlightened rule of Carlos III until, at his death in 1788, it had so far regained its position that, if not yet a power of the first rank, it might not unhopefully look forward to attaining that position. Then followed the weak and disastrous reign of Carlos IV, under the guidance of Godoy, when impotence invited the intrusion of Napoleon, resulting in the manifestation of national energy which surprised the world in the heroic War of Liberation. After the Restoration in 1814, the land was for more than half a century the scene of almost unintermittent conflict between antagonistic forces, resulting in apathy of exhaustion after attaining the form of democratic constitutional monarchy. Yet we are told that absolute monarchy has merely been replaced by absolute caciquismo, or in American parlance, the rule of the political boss. Government, it seems, is exploited purely for the private interest of the office-holding class, and the strength of the nation has been wasted. Its development has been neglected until the unexpected feebleness revealed in the War of 1898 led earnest patriots to declare that, if the existing maladministration were to continue, it would be better to seek shelter under England or France and put an end to the history of Spain as an independent nation. This shock to the national consciousness and the skillful and vigorous agitation to which it gave birth bear promise of results in the political as well as in the material and industrial development of the land. And we may reasonably hope that a nation which has suffered so much with fortitude is entering upon a new career that may make amends for the miseries of the past. Vicissitudes such as these have their causes, and we cannot conclude this long history of the Inquisition without inquiring what share it in the spirit which at once created and was stimulated by it contributed to the misfortunes endured with few intermissions by the Spanish people since its organization. These causes are numerous, many of them not directly connected with our subject, but yet to be enumerated in order that undue importance may not be ascribed to the influence of the Inquisition. To begin with, the Spanish monarchy developed into a pure despotism based on the maxim of the Institutes, quod principi placuit legis habet vigorem. The prince's pleasure has the force of law. All legislative and executive functions were concentrated in the crown. The king issued laws, levied taxes, raised troops, declared war, made peace at his will, and the execution of the Justicia Lanuza in 1591 without a trial shows that the lives of his subjects were at his disposal. It was the same with their liberties as illustrated by the imprisonment without a hearing of ministers like Cabarrus, Floridablanca, Javarenos, and Arquillo. For a while the ancient fueros of the kingdom of the Crown of Aragon served as some restraint in those territories, but Philip V in 1707 and 1714 took advantage of the War of Succession to declare them forfeited. Under such concentration of authority, the fate of the nation depended on the character and capacity of the monarch. Charles V had unquestioned ability, but his ambitious enterprises, while flattering to the national vanity, not only exhausted the resources of Spain in quarrels foreign to its interests, but crippled its prosperity by the reckless devices employed to supply his needs. Philip II was a man of very moderate talents, irresolute and procrastinating to that degree that the Venetian envoy Vandremino in 1595 declared that what would cost another prince 10 ducats cost him 100 in consequence of his dilatoriness. His enormous and disjointed empire was too much for his narrow intelligence, and his vast expenditures in defense of Latin Christianity consumed all his resources and kept him in perpetual financial straits. At his death in 1598, he had nothing to show for the ruin of his country but the gloomy pile of the Escorial and acquisition of Portugal. Holland was hopelessly lost. His rival, Henry IV, was firmly seated on the throne of a reunited France, and the papacy was alienated. The internal condition of the land is depicted in the despairing complaints of the Cortes of 1594. The truth, which cannot be questioned, is that the kingdom is totally exhausted. Scarce any man has money or credit, and those who have it do not employ it in trade or for profit, but hoard it to live as sparingly as possible, in the hope that it may last them to the end. Thus comes to the universal poverty of all classes. There is not a city or a town but has lost largely in population, as is seen by the multitude of closed and empty houses, and the fall in the rents of the few that are inhabited. With Philip III we commence the long line of favorites who dominated Spain during the 17th century. Well-meaning but weak and incapable, he left everything to the Duke of Lerma, under whose guidance a reckless course of prodigality was followed, as though the only trouble was to get rid of the surplus revenues. Charles V had cast aside the severe simplicity of the old Castilian court for the stately magnificence of the Burgundian household. His successors followed his example, in spite of the remonstrances of the Cortes, but where Philip II spent on it 400,000 ducats a year, Philip III lavished 1,300,000 while he was begging money of his nobles and prelates, and seeking to seize all the plate in the kingdom in order to coin it. He was not alone in this, for the nobility and gentry were consumed with usury and overwhelmed with debt owing to their extravagance. The Venetian envoy Contarini in 1605 describes the land as overspread with poverty and general discontent, and all the evils attendant upon a corrupt and a vicious government, under an indolent king and a rapacious and incapable minister. The worst war, he concludes, that could be made on Spain was to allow it to consume itself in peace under misgovernment, while to attack it would be to arouse the dogged determination of the people. The reports of the luscious envoys tells the same story. Such was the condition when the expulsion of the Moriscos robbed the land of its most productive class. Matters grew worse when Philip IV ascended the throne in 1621. Good-natured, affable, indolent, and pleasure-loving, his 31 unacknowledged natural children besides the acknowledged one. The second Don John of Austria served to explain why he abandoned the cares of state to his favorite, the Count Duke Olivers, after whose fall in 1643 his nephew Don Luis de Haro succeeded to the post. The official historiographer describes Spain at his accession as being in extremity and the people crushed under their burdens. Everything was in disorder, and the condition of the nation so weakened that it could only be deplored and not amended. Yet Philip's first act was to break the truce with Holland, and from that time to the end of his long reign he was involved in almost continual war. He called together the Cortes and asked for supplies, to which they replied by petitioning him to try to stop the general depopulation and find occupation for the people who were wandering with their families over the country in vain search for work. Yet Philip, engrossed with his plebeian amours and pleasures of his court, continued his wars and his extravagance, without giving a thought to the misery of his people, whom he was crushing with ever new exactions. The courtly festivities were conducted with a magnificence till then unexampled. The Carnival Festival of 1637 was officially admitted to cost 300,000 ducats and was popularly estimated at half a million. In 1658, the Venetian envoy reports his giving to the son of Don Luis de Haro 50,000 pesos for skilfully arranging a ballet for the ladies of the court. Every bullfight cost him 60,000 reales, and the celebration at the birth of Prince Prosper, who speedily died, involved an expenditure of 800,000 pesos. All this, as the envoy remarks, was extracted from the blood of the miserable people, who were poorer in Spain than anywhere else. The immense resources of the kingdom were absorbed by the rapacity of the ministers, or were dissipated by the profuseness of the king. In 1665, Carlos II, then but 4 years of age, succeeded to his father, under the regency of the Queen Dowager Maria Anna of Austria. We have seen how she abandoned affairs to her confessor, the Jesuit Nita, and when he was dismissed by the efforts of Don John of Austria in 1669, she replaced him with the worthless favorite Fernando de Valenzuela. Again, Don John was called in, Valenzuela was exiled to the Philippines, and Don John assumed the reins of the government. His limited abilities were unequal to the task. He was driven from power and died soon afterwards in 1679. Carlos had been declared of age in 1675. He was utterly incapable, and though he can scarce be said to have had favorites under such ministers as the Duke of Medinaceli and the Count of Oropesa, Spain sank deeper in misery and degradation until his death in 1700. The kingdom was reduced to the last extremity, without money, without industry, without means of defense to resist the aggressive wars of Louis XIV, or to defend the colonies from the ravages of buccaneers. The population is said to have shrunk to 5,000,000. In 1586 it had been estimated at 8,000,000 by the Venetian envoy Gradenigo. Such was the result of 2 centuries of absolute government under monarchs not wilfully evil, who merely reigned according to the light vouchsafed them. Yet it was not so much the extravagance of the court, or the perpetual wars of the Habsburgs, or the emigration to the colonies that reduced the population and the power of Spain. The land could have endured all these if its rich resources and vast opportunities had been wisely developed. Lying between two seas and holding Sicily and Naples, it commanded the Atlantic and the Mediterranean with its wealthy colonies, the source of the precious metals which revolutionized the finances of Europe and furnished the basis for the most profitable commerce that the world had seen. It was invited to become the greatest of maritime states, with a navy and a mercantile marine beyond rivalry, dominating the seas as the Catalans had dominated the Mediterranean in the 13th and the 14th centuries. It was largely secured from hostile aggression by the Pyrenees and could work out its destinies with little to fear from external enemies. It is true that much of its surface is mountainous and that large districts suffer from insufficient precipitation, But the Moors had shown what wonders could be wrought by irrigation and how by patient labor even mountainsides could be made to yield their increase. No land could boast a greater variety of agricultural products, including those of semi-tropical and temperate zones, which, combined with mineral wealth, should have rendered it self-supporting. All that was needed was a steady and intelligent industry fostered by wise legislation, encouraging production and commerce, and enabling every man to work out his own career with as few artificial impediments as possible. And Spain might be today what she was in the 16th century, the leader among civilized nations. That was not to be. The fatal gift of the Burgundian inheritance distracted the attention of her rulers from the true arena of her expansion in Africa and on the ocean to distant enterprises wholly foreign to her true interests, while the undeviating determination to enforce unity of faith at home and to combat heresy elsewhere led her to drive out her most useful population and involved her in ruinous expenditures abroad. To extort the means for the furtherance of this policy, industry was strangled with the most burdensome and complicated system of taxation that human folly could devise, the weight of which fell almost exclusively on the oppressed producing classes, who were least able to endure it, while the nobles and gentry and clergy, who held by far the larger portion of the Spanish wealth, were exempt. As taxation was virtually at the discretion of the monarch, imposts were added as the exigencies of extravagance demanded, usually with little thought as to their consequences, until the taxpayer was entangled in a network which crippled him at every step. This, moreover, was accompanied with regulations to prevent evasions and to protect the consumer at the expense of the producer, which greatly enhanced the deadly influence of the anomalous and incongruous accumulation of exactions. End of section 85. Recording by Mukund Manikarnike from Tempe, Arizona. mmanikar.com